Yes, the point that I wanted to make was that since we're asked to talk about the balancing of powers, it seems to me that the ASEAN centrality that is so hallowed and desired by the ASEAN member states has been under pressure for at least, I think, 7 years, since 2010. I actually date the unraveling of ASEAN centrality to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's speech in Hanoi in 2010, where she threw down a gauntlet towards China on the South China Sea, and this started to destabilize the ASEAN centrality because it was becoming thereafter very, very difficult to balance the two major superpowers, because as China and the US ramped up their geopolitical competition over the South China Sea and other issues, it became, for all the reasons that Domsak just mentioned, the weakness of the ASEAN institutions just couldn't handle this sort of gargantuan superpower struggle going on in Southeast Asia. And so what we have seen subsequently is the inability of ASEAN to reach a consensus on some of these sensitive issues, even to produce statements has proved difficult. And this has, I think, really undermined and unraveled ASEAN centrality. So rather than bemoan the problem, what I'd like to do is maybe say a few words about what I think should be done to restore ASEAN centrality, which I think is in the interests of everybody, the US, China, Japan, Korea. I mean, in the heyday of ASEAN centrality in the mid to late 1990s, early 2000s, I mean, everyone would come to ASEAN to seek a sort of a Pacific forum or space in which to somehow reduce tensions, not to resolve problems, but to manage and reduce tensions. And ASEAN, I think, has always been very effective in terms of as a tool of managing collective security, not resolving issues, but managing them. And this, I think, has started to unravel. And so what we could do in terms of trying to strengthen that centrality, I think one very basic thing would be to go back and look at the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. There are mechanisms within that treaty that would really, I think, help refocus everyone who wants to be a dialogue partner or to be formally associated with ASEAN essentially signs on to that treaty. So my question would be, why don't let's take a look at the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation and what could be done to try and implement some of the institutions within, or the mechanisms within that treaty that guarantee ASEAN's peace and security. The second thing, I think, concerns the sensitive issue of the Code of Conduct, and I was in a discussion in Bangkok last week about Mekong, and one of the things that was said about a faraway place in Europe which is managing river issues was that the riparian states themselves were able to use a set of guidelines that the European Union had produced on managing rivers. And it struck me that why can't ASEAN as a whole come up with its own set of guidelines, an own code of conduct for managing, say, navigation in the South China Sea or navigation in the Mekong or in all rivers, so that each of the member states and each of the sub-regions could actually refer to a set of ASEAN guidelines. Why is it that the code of conduct is being negotiated with China? Why didn't the ASEAN member states themselves negotiate their own code of conduct? And then you can simply say to the Chinese, well, if you want to cooperate with us, here is our code of conduct. In the same way that that ASEAN has asked people to sign on to the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. So in other words, strengthen the institutions for managing security within ASEAN itself, rather than complicated by negotiating with other countries, which I think has become very, very complicated. Those are the points that the other point I was going to make, and it refers to what was said earlier about leadership. I feel that the other, apart from blaming the US and China and the big powers for weakening ASEAN centrality, I think ASEAN is also partly to blame. There is no point in having all these mechanisms and institutions for managing tensions and security if ASEAN itself, the ASEAN member states themselves, are too shy about involving themselves in one another's affairs. And this is, of course, has always been the weakness of ASEAN. the virulent sovereignty of each member state. The fact is that ASEAN as a collective regional organization simply is not inclined towards strengthening institutions that would mean interference in one another's affairs. And the effective management of security today, as we know, involves intervention of one form or another. And that simply is not going to happen in ASEAN under its current configuration. And so all the mechanisms that exist notionally to strengthen ASEAN as a security body, there is no appetite for using them within ASEAN. As Deng Sak will continue to remind us, that this is, the sovereignty trumps everything else. That, I think, is a built-in weakness for ASEAN that prevents it from becoming a more effective, active mechanism for managing collective security. It does pretty well already without the complications of superpowers, in the sense that ASEAN has not been to war, ASEAN member states have not been to war with one another since ASEAN was formed. In many ways, the glass half full argument is how effective ASEAN is without interference, without anything that affects and infringes on sovereignty in managing security. That's all well and good. But under the current circumstances, where there is much more pressure from the outside world, from the two major superpowers, ASEAN needs to strengthen these institutions and learn to use them more effectively. And that's going to mean that something's got to give. Maybe it's sovereignty.